Hey guys, my name is Lev and I'm a photographer and videographer from Hamburg, and today we're going to talk about the one lens I used for all of my commissions for 1 year and why you should use it too. Alright, so this is going to be part story time, part gear talk, so just bear with me if I'm going to talk a little bit about my situation back then. It was the year 2017 and I just finished my studies in visual communications design. And back then I already had this huge student loan, so I didn't want to go to the bank and didn't want to get a credit for building my own equipment. I wanted to find something cheap to really fastly start taking commissions, make more money, start to build my own equipment. So what I did back then was go to a photography store, secondhand department, and got myself a Sony A7R. It had like, I think 40 megapixels, so I was really wowed by the megapixels and the quality, but I really wasn't into buying Sony lenses, and I'm really glad that I didn't spend any money on that, because I was always a fan of the EF lenses, how the images looked and how the sharpness and the detail was with these lenses. And I always thought that kind of the Sony lenses, and that's just a personal preference, looked very technical, very digital. So I really liked the EF lenses back then, so I decided to get an adapter. It was also used really cheap from Sigma, so I could adapt EF lenses to my Sony body. And then I decided to look for a lens, and the very first lens that I felt like I had to get was a 50mm. I looked for the 50mm 1.4 lens, and it cost new about $300, and I didn't have the kind of money back then, so I decided to look a little bit further and saw one for $100. But in autofocus mode the lens wouldn't focus right, so I had to always use manual focus. And since I already planned on doing a lot of video, that wasn't a problem for me. And with focus peaking, that was very new at that time with the Sony A7R, well, at least the first generation, I felt like I could nail the focus anyway, so I decided to get that little lens. And what can I say? 1 year later, I still only had that lens, and I really want to talk about why that was. Well, when I first started shooting with the lens, I already had some experience shooting with the cameras that I got in university. But in retrospect, I don't think I knew how to use any of that lenses for real, you know what I mean? Like, I knew what each of these lenses would do, but I didn't have the right feel for it, so I was kind of just experimenting and shooting into the blue. When I started shooting with the 50mm, I realized that after week 1, week 2, week 3, I got really accustomed to it, and I started to see finished images in my head that I wanted to create, and the way from seeing it in my head and actually creating that image got really fast. So I think the more you get to know your lens, the more you can see finished images and the finished product in your head, and it's easier for you to translate your imagery in your head to imagery that you actually created. And I think that's a really important part, is to know your lenses inside out and to actually know what the image is going to look like before you actually shoot it. And I got so used to this lens that I started to use it for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, until it was half a year, and I started playing around with the thought of getting new lenses. But I always had the feeling that I didn't quite use everything of the lens I could. Like, I haven't reached the potential of this lens yet. So I decided to just keep on with it, with the broken 50mm lens, and just keep going with it and try to get even more out of it. And I think it was the most important journey for me in photography, to actually take the time to get to know one lens. And I shot commissions with it. So I went to business shootings and to portrait shootings with that lens. I shot videos with that lens. And I could have always rented other lenses, so that was always an option, and sometimes I brought backup, but ended up using only the 50mm lens because I was so used to it and I created the best images with it. So After a year, I slowly started getting more and more lenses because I was trying to get into new fields of photography like sports and food. So I needed something like a macro, for example, or a very wide angle lens. But I think that was the most important journey in my photography kind of education that I did for myself, was to stick with one lens for a very long time. And let's just talk a little bit about the characteristics of this lens. It's very detailed, it's very sharp, it has this kind of digital sharpness to it, but I kind of really like it because you can always take away some of the clarity and some of the structure, and you can always add some haze, but you can't really introduce sharpness back into an image that is already blurry. So I really liked it, and it doesn't seem too technical. I don't know if you get what I mean, but it's not overly sharp, but it is tack sharp if you need it to be. Also, of course, the aperture 1.4 is, I think, the ultimate what you need. Like shooting at 1.2 is just a hassle because the focus depth or the kind of distance of focus is so small that you often miss it, and 1.4 is, in my opinion, plenty. So why not take the 1.8 50mm, which is new. You can get it for $100 I think and used for 50. Is just the build quality. I think something built out of metal and actual glass is always going to be a little bit better than the kind of plasticky lens. But if you feel better with that, the 1.8 Canon EF 50mm nifty 50 lens is amazing. Get it if you can afford that one. But I'm really happy with the decision I made back then of getting that lens, and I think yeah, that's one thing I wanted to talk about today, because I feel like we as photographers are more than ever really obsessed with the thought of getting more gear, more equipment, more options, and oftentimes we don't even scrap the surface of the potential of the gear that we actually own. And I constantly have to remind myself of that. And for example, right now I'm shooting on an old Canon FD lens that was like stored away in my cellar for about a year, and I just reintroduced it into my workflow, and I'm really happy with it. So if you're also really happy with it, comment down below. That's it for the video, I think, and yeah, see you soon. До свидания.